Hello, everyone. Thank you to over 200 participants joining us today for this expert roundtable on reparations in Ukraine. My name is Yvonne Dutton, and I am a senior legal advisor at PILPG and a professor of law at the Indiana University Robert H. McKinney School of Law. I will be moderating today's discussion, and I am honored to be guiding the conversation with these experts. The Public International Law and Policy Group is a global pro bono law firm providing free legal assistance to parties involved in peace negotiations, post-conflict constitutions, and atrocity crimes prosecution. This roundtable is part of PILPG's Thought Leadership Initiative. This initiative aims to share expertise and reflections from our work by organizing periodic roundtables that focus on prominent international law issues and pressing global conflicts. Today's expert roundtable is part of our Ukraine series, a series which aims to discuss recent developments in the Ukraine-Russia war, ponder complex legal questions related to those developments, and inform audiences of important international legal principles. As part of this series, PILPG holds expert roundtables every other Friday from 12 to 1 p.m. Eastern Time. For today's expert roundtable, we will be discussing Russia's financial responsibility for damages, the role reparations may have in post-conflict reconstruction, including what a victim-centered approach to reparations may look like, and the international support needed to hold Russia accountable for damages inflicted since its invasion. The Russia invasion has thus far led to thousands of civilian deaths and massive destruction of Ukrainian cities. In places like the city of Mariupol, Ukrainian officials have reported that at least 95% of the city has been destroyed during the Russian bombardment. Russian attacks have damaged and destroyed critical property and infrastructure, including historical buildings, cultural sites, residential homes, schools, bridges, and hospitals. In response to Russia's illegal actions and its contravention of core international legal principles, the international community has imposed fierce sanctions targeting every sector of the Russian economy. Nonetheless, there are more economic measures states can adopt to punish Russia and repair the damage Russia has caused in Ukraine. News outlets and international analysts have been persistently calling for the adoption of measures that would make Russia pay for the destruction inflicted in Ukraine. Reparations in the context of the Russian invasion of Ukraine would include both material and symbolic measures to both recognize and compensate for the harms inflicted by Russia. This roundtable will be 60 minutes long. Our distinguished panelists include Professor Lori R. Blank, Markian Kluchakovsky, Tetiana Sevchuk, Professor Chiara Giorgetti, and Anish Hazra. Today's event will be recorded and subsequently posted on our website. We ask that you please submit any questions you have for our speakers using the Q&A function. Now, let me introduce our panelists. We are excited to welcome Professor Lori Blank, who is a clinical professor of law, director of the Center for International and Comparative Law, and director of the International Humanitarian Law Clinic at Emory University School of Law. Professor Blank is the co-editor of the End of War Project, a multi-year project exploring a range of legal, policy, moral, and strategic challenges in ending complex counterterrorism and counterinsurgency conflicts. In addition, she is a senior fellow at the Lieber Institute for Law and Land Warfare, the chair of the American Society of International Law Lieber Prize Committee, and a term member of the American Bar Association's Advisory Committee to the Standing Committee on Law and National Security. Also joining us today is Markian Kluchakovsky, partner at Astor's law firm in Kyiv, and co-chair of the firm's international arbitration and litigation practice. He is a member of the working group on the development and implementation of an international legal mechanism for compensation for damages caused to Ukraine as a result of armed aggression by the Russian Federation, which was established by President Zelensky on May 18, 2022, and he serves as an advisor to the Office of the President of Ukraine. We are honored to welcome Tetiana Sevchuk, a legal counsel and advocacy manager with the Anti-Corruption Action Center in Kyiv, where her work focuses on anti-corruption, asset recovery, anti-money laundering initiatives, and sanction policies. Since the full-scale Russian invasion, together with other Ukrainian civil society activists, Tatiana joined the International Center for Ukrainian Victory in Warsaw. The ICUV advocates for Ukrainian interests internationally and supports civil society actions for Ukraine's victory. Welcome also to Professor Chiara Giorgetti, Professor of Law at Richmond Law School, immediate past chair of ITA's Academic Council, and vice president of the American branch of the International Law Association. She is also a senior fellow at Columbia Law School's International Claims and Reparations Project, and also a member of the working group on the development and implementation of an international legal mechanism for compensation for damages caused to Ukraine, together with Mr. Kluczykowski. We finally welcome Anish Hazra, an associate based in the London office of Morrison & Foerster and a member of the firm's litigation group. Anish advises on internal and regulatory investigations, as well as commercial litigation before the English courts in cases with a significant international or cross-border element. Most recently, Anish and a wider team at Morrison & Foerster have been working with the Public International Law and Policy Group on the property restitution issues that may arise out of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I would like to welcome everyone and thank you for participating in this panel. And I'm going to get started now with some of our questions, and I'm going to turn it to Professor Lori Blank. Professor Blank, could you describe what we mean when we talk about war reparations? What does this mean for Russia and Ukraine?
So thanks so much, and thanks to PILPG for putting on this great event and this great series. It's not the happiest of topics, but always good to make sure we keep the conversation going. So war reparations are pretty much exactly what they sound like. They are payments, usually by one state to another state, but also to individuals or communities at the end of a conflict to compensate for the damage and injury and death inflicted. Traditionally, back in the past, they were called war indemnities. And until the 20th century, they were pretty much the only mechanism for compensation after a conflict. And often the victor would demand compensation to cover its costs for fighting in the war. But traditionally, over time, what reparations are really about is compensating for harm that is caused. An important aspect of this is that under international law, states are required, they're obligated to make reparations for breaches of international law. So this is a foundational case from the Permanent Court of International Justice. And anytime a state breaches its obligations under international law, it has an obligation to make reparation for that. Now, what does this mean in the context of the current conflict? We are essentially, as we're watching the events, at least those of us who are far away, most of the discourse is focused, understandably, on how to stop it. Obviously, critical, important first question, and who and how to hold accountable for the atrocities that are being committed, for the damage that's being inflicted, for the harm, and so on. The idea of reparations is another essential ingredient here. Accountability is not just you, either person or state, did something wrong, so we're going to punish you and say you're guilty. And if your person put you in jail, etc. Reparations is another piece of accountability, and it gets to justice. It gets to a focus on the victims by making sure that they actually receive either monetary or compensation restitution in form of return of property or status, that there are funds for rebuilding. And in that way, reparations can help contribute to a durable peace after a conflict by helping to repair as best as possible sort of the wounds that a conflict causes across society.
Thank you. Let me turn it to Ms. Shevchuk. Could you please introduce to our audience today the kinds of destruction that this war has inflicted and why it would require some form of reparation? And I'm going to ask you a follow-up, then I'll just state it now too. How important are reparations for Ukraine, and what is the responsibility of Russia, sort of as you answer that question?
Okay, maybe I will start from the follow-up, because for Ukraine, the reparations itself, of course, are important on the level of compensating for the harm caused by Russia. But first and foremost, it's about justice and accountability, because Russia attacked Ukraine not just on February 21st this year. It attacked Ukraine 8 years ago and was not held accountable for what it has done. Reparations should become this measure of accountability, firstly showing that Russia is guilty of violating international law, and then it's a measure of accountability, so preventing the further attacks, like Professor Blank already told us. And on the other step is counting the damages done to Ukraine by Russia, because the damage is huge and it's on the various level. Of course, the big level is damage to the critical infrastructure caused to Ukraine, because we have destroyed power plants, destroyed ports, roads, bridges, their oil depots, energy depots. So critical infrastructure has been destroyed. Their local infrastructure has been destroyed, something that is vital for the life of people, like water plants, heating plants. Without this, cities are uninhabitable. And of course, residential areas. We've seen several cities destroyed to the rubble, like Mariupol, Popasna, Volnovakha. Kharkiv is a big city, but part of it is inhabitable as well. A residential area on the north where it's impossible to live because it's either destroyed or it's under the constant shelling. And it will require lots of funds to restore it, plus to return people to those areas and cities, and the reparations, the funds should help them. And the other issue, of course, people who were harmed by the war, this was victims of war crimes, their families, the people killed or wounded during the war. But this is also, we should remember about people who are on occupied territories, who struggle under Russian control, and people who've been forcefully deported to Russia from the occupied territories. These people all need compensations for the harm done by Russia.
Thank you. Let me turn it to Professor Giorgetti. And I note that you have previously acted as counsel in front of the United Nations Compensation Commission and at the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission. Would you be able to discuss your work there a little bit and tell us about any lessons learned from this work that might be applicable to the situation in Ukraine?
Absolutely. Thank you very much, Yvonne, and thank you for having me here. It's really a privilege to discuss, to be with you, and also to discuss this very important topic. Yes, I had actually I've acted in front of the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission and then UNCC and representing states there. And I think it is very important to think about those examples, and really I think the most important lessons learned from the EEC and the UNCC is that claims commission can be highly flexible mechanisms, instruments that can provide reparations to those who were injured, those who were suffer injuries and consequences of a war or an invasion. And when I think about flexibility, really, we think about all sorts of flexibilities. First of all, think about the establishment of a claims commission. The Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission was established with a bilateral treaty. The UNCC was established through a resolution of the Security Council. In terms of jurisdiction, here also, what are the subject matter jurisdiction, personal jurisdiction, what kind of individuals can claim an injury, and what kind of state reparations can also, state injury can also be compensated. And also in terms of duration, the UNCC was an instrument that lasted for a very long time. The Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission, on the other hand, had a very expedite process. And so here we really have flexibility throughout many different forums. And the composition also, Claims Commission, the UNCC Claims Commission was composed of many different panels of claims, while the EC really looked much more as an arbitration panel. So here we really have a flexible instrument. Claims Commission can be really a flexible instrument and can be a successful instrument. And in that way, I think that but of course, the challenge is also, but I think that the lessons learned by the UNCC, by the history and the practice of the UNCC and the Eritrea-Ethiopia Claims Commission can inform the thinking of any future claims commission for Ukraine, so that a successful mechanism can build on those instruments and can create a successful instrument that provide compensation and holds Russia accountable.
Thank you. Mr. Hazra, following up on this idea of lessons learned, essentially, can you also tell us a little bit about how reparations issues have been dealt with in the past in other conflict situations?
Thanks very much, Yvonne, and thanks very much to PILPG for organizing this and for the opportunity to speak with such a distinguished panel. So I and a few others at Morrison and Forrester have been working closely with PILPG on some of the property restitution issues that Ukraine may face as a result of the invasion by Russia. And I think Professor Giorgetti just mentioned how flexible claims commissions can be as a tool. And what we've had the opportunity to do is study a little bit about how these issues have been dealt with by previous claims commissions or property restitution commissions. And I think there are a range of approaches. I mean, there are certainly different approaches depending on the types of loss that individuals or victims have suffered as a result of conflict. So where lives have been lost, or where you're dealing with physical injury or long-term disability, there tend to be fewer options to put individuals back in the place that they were before the conflict. And you find that financial compensation is the main tool that such commissions use to address those types of losses. But in the case of property loss, which is often for many people the most valuable asset that they might have had prior to the conflict, there seems to be a diversity of options in terms of what's been used before. I think often the first port of call for most commissions is to look at restitution, trying to see if they can give back to victims the property or the thing that they had prior to the conflict. Now, sometimes that's going to be impossible because the property doesn't exist anymore. It can't be employed in the same way. I'm sure that's the kind of issue that we're going to be facing here in Ukraine. And I think Ms. Shevchuk was talking about the sheer scale of the destruction that we've seen in parts of Ukraine. Some commissions, and I think this has been tried in Colombia following their civil war, try to also provide something equivalent to the property that may have been lost. So a compensation, not with the very thing that was lost, but with something that could be similar or equivalent in another part of the country. And finally, if that's also not possible, then we sort of fall back on financial compensation and trying to give people the means to be able to move on with their lives. What I would say, though, is that while there are a range of tools, the available remedies depend quite a lot on the shape of how a conflict progresses and how it ends or stabilizes. So taking the UNCC example that Professor Giorgetti mentioned, I mean, that was following the 1990s Gulf War and Kuwait, and their restitution was a bit more possible because many of, for most affected Kuwaitis, there wasn't a sustained loss of Kuwaiti territory. But if you're dealing with a situation where there are extended periods of occupation, the use of land can change, and you could deal with, extensive secondary occupation. So the way the conflict ends makes a big difference. And similarly, if you reach an accord or a settlement between the parties that are in conflict with each other, that may mean it's possible to reach some kind of negotiated means of reparations, but that's not always the case. So there's certainly patterns in how we can actually distribute these reparations to victims, but I think a lot depends on how a conflict progresses and how it ends.
Thank you. Let's continue with Mr. Kluczykowski. Just last month, you were appointed by President Zelensky to the War Damage Compensation Working Group. Can you tell us about the purpose of the group and what the aims are, what you aim to accomplish with that group?
Thank you, Professor Dutton. And first of all, thank you to PILPG for putting this event together and giving me an opportunity to attend and speak. As for the working group, as the saying goes, it's in the name. When the war started, being an arbitration lawyer in normal life, so to speak, I started thinking, what are the ways to sue Russia for all the damages it is inflicting, for all the property damage, first and foremost? What is the proper forum, proper jurisdiction for it? And I quickly ran out of options because for one reason or another, whether it's jurisdiction, whether it is sovereign immunity or a lack of subject matter competence, all the conventional international or national bodies are not fit for that purpose, or not entirely fit for that purpose, or in the very least, their judgments have no way of being adequately enforced and executed against Russia. And then we went back into history books, so to speak, and looked how similar situations were addressed over the past at least 80 years. And we looked at the examples of claims commissions of the past, but it also became patently clear that this was going to be a very difficult task because all the claims commissions of the past 80 years, in the very least, relied on one of two things: either the consent of the other state, the other party, or the direct decision or resolution of the Security Council of the United Nations. Again, it became patently clear that neither of the options are going to we're not going to be able to rely on either of the two options, given how Russia behaves. So it became very clear to us that the only realistic way to achieve accountability with respect to compensation of damage caused by war is establishing something new that does not exist at the moment. So along with several colleagues, along with Professor Giorgetti and several others, we got together and put forward a proposal for Ukrainian government for creation of a sort of a claims commission, but not through the Security Council resolution, but through a more complicated, perhaps, way, through a multilateral international agreement. And this is essentially the purpose of the working group established by President Zelensky now almost 2 months ago, time flies, is to work out that proposal, advance it and enhance it, take it through rigorous process of expert review and expert debate, take it through the necessary diplomatic process so that at the end of the day, we had a proper forum where the victims of Russian aggression could submit their claims and legitimately and reasonably expect to be compensated for the damage they have suffered.
Yes, and since Mr. Kluczykowski, you mentioned that Professor Giorgetti has been working on this with you, I'm going to turn it over to her to tell us a little bit more about the Claims Commission and, purposes and goals and, just to sort of elaborate a little bit more on this topic.
Certainly, thank you very much. As it was just said, when we look at what is available in terms of providing a reparation mechanism, we see that we don't really have an established mechanism. We can't really go to the International Court of Justice, for example, or other existing mechanism. And I think a claims commission, and especially as really proven by history, can be a successful and flexible instrument that may be adapted in this situation. So if you think about the purpose, I mean, very simply, the purpose is to provide full compensation and reparation to those who were injured because of Russia's invasions. And some have already said that here, really, there is no doubt that the invasion is an act of aggression that violates international law. And as such, Russia is required through really the principle of international state responsibility to provide reparation. And one can argue that because the act of aggression is a violation of an erga omnes provision, all the international community can also play a very important role. So we did that in the large context. More specifically, the Claims Commission here, the process that we are undertaking, we're trying to define, first of all, what kind of violations occurred. We have here, of course, an act of aggression. We also have continuous violation of international humanitarian law, human rights, international economic law, and many others kind of international law are, principles are violated. What kind of injuries have existed? What kind of claims? We talked about claims of individuals. We already said that a very large number of Ukrainians are now displaced, either internally displaced or had to leave Ukraine. We have some examples of compensation that was given in such situations, for example, from the UNCC, where individuals that had to flee were compensated a certain specific amount. But the damage, the injuries is not only confined to individuals, it's also to states, state property, cultural properties, and many others. So how to identify the injury, how to identify, how to collect the evidence, and what is the mechanism, what is the preferred mechanism on how to do it. I think, of course, the General Assembly can play a very important role, has already said something very meaningful in the resolution that it held condemning Russia for the acts of aggression. I think it can play a bigger role in trying to establish at least an initial collecting evidence collecting body, or a body that can serve some purpose for in direction of the Claims Commission. And then, of course, one key question is how to disburse the funds, how to obtain the funds, and how to disburse the funds. And so we have many questions there. There are many different ways in which we can do it, and I know we might turn to that later. But I think what is the purpose of a claim commission, and the goal is to have a legitimate, clear process that is rooted in international law and is able to provide and disburse funds for violation, to compensate injuries caused by international law violations through binding awards. And so we have the goal is high, but I think it's feasible, and we can think about what kind of claims and how to go, and we're thinking about how to best achieve these goals.
Excellent. I do want to delve into this, something we mentioned in the introduction, and that and I think Professor Giorgetti even talked about a little bit getting into practice, how this would work in practice. And I wanted to focus with Professor Blank on this question of victim-informed reparations, and what exactly does that mean? How does that work in practice when we're talking about a reparations practice? And do you have any thoughts also on the types of damages that should make an individual entitled to any reparations that might be available? So just talk about this a little bit more in practice.
Sure, and I'll pick up on some of the great things that have already been raised and try not to repeat anything. Reparations, when we think about all the post-conflict tools that are available, when you think about the field of transitional justice and the various mechanisms and tools for countries emerging from conflict, reparations is the only one that is truly and uniquely victim focused. Everything about emerging from conflict obviously touches on victims and has to do with trying to either bring justice, accountability, rebuilding, etc. But reparations are primarily and singularly about the victim. And so anytime we're talking about reparations, we're already in a victim-centered, victim-informed space, which is critical, because international law and the international community has obviously evolved dramatically from the certainly pre-World War I, but really even pre-World War II days, when states were the actors and individuals were the, swept along in the currents of what states did with each other. And reparations used to be that way as well. States paid another state, and whether an individual got anything, to be simplistic, really depended on whether his or her own state dispersed. In the aftermath of World War II, we began to see the engagement of individuals and communities, so non-state participants in the process of reparations, which was obviously critically important. One of the things I think that's important to think about, kind of going down a couple of paths here, is first of all, when we say victim informed, victim centered, we can actually think about victim in a couple of ways in this particular context of Ukraine, and obviously in any context. Obviously, we have individuals, human beings in Ukraine who have been killed, who have been injured, whose property is destroyed, who have been displaced. The harm we have already detailed, and we could spend many of these panel discussions simply detailing the extent of the harm. But we can think of victim as communities also, because communities are being torn apart as people are displaced. And so it's not just each individual, but it's the community that those individuals built as a collective that's also a victim. And that's one reason that the international law that applies during wartime doesn't only protect individuals, but it protects cultural property and religious property and all the facets of civilian infrastructure that it enables societies to sustain themselves. And so we want to think about that, I think, as well. There's obviously the state of Ukraine is also clearly a victim. Historically, we've always thought about states as an actor, so we also have that. A couple of lessons that are evident in taking from the world of transitional justice and that discourse is that any post-conflict process, whether it's reparations, accountability, truth-seeking, needs to be holistic, needs to connect with the other post-conflict processes. And that's equally important here with reparations, because both to inform the reparations process itself, there's an enormous amount of very robust documentation going on right now. That documentation is not just important for accountability, but for identifying how reparations could be designed and dispersed. The process of figuring out who merits reparation can also contribute to the documentation for accountability purposes, because it obviously contributes there as well. So there's interesting questions about how to share information back and forth between mechanisms. And the last thing I'll note here in this sense is that ultimately victim-centered, victim-informed also has to do with the process, not just the who gets something, who has been harmed, who merits compensation, but also the process, who is contributing to the discourse and the discussions about those questions. And that's another sort of constant takeaway from almost any transitional justice process is the need for a robust and holistic engagement of society in the design, in the thinking about how a process should be set up. We can easily imagine that one could total up some massive number that represents the harm that Russia has caused. I don't know that I can count high enough, but enough zeros might get us there. And okay, big payment, that's going to cover all these costs. But one could easily see that a lump sum payment might look too easy, right? Like you're getting off too easy, like just write a check. Don't face up to the harm that you caused. It doesn't require a reckoning with the harm, the crimes, the victims. And that is very much for Ukrainian society, for Ukrainian, the public, the government all together to wrestle with. What is a meaningful type of reparation? And the external community can help, but can't say, oh, no, this is meaningful for you, right? That's not particularly helpful. So process, and obviously who, right? Who constitutes a victim? Those are all going to be important questions.
Thank you. Let's, since you mentioned, priorities for Ukraine, I'm going to turn it to Ms. Shevchuk now and sort of talk about Ukraine reparations, establishing a mechanism. Can you start us off with what you think are some of the priorities here for Ukraine when we're talking about a reparations mechanism? And then I'm going to turn it afterwards to Mr. Kluchkovsky to sort of start talking about challenges. So we can talk about some priorities and then we'll move on to some challenges in addressing these. Unmute.
Sorry. So the priority number one is when we start the process of reparations, because there is a lot of talking that we need to wait until the war is over or until the conflict is stabilized, is in stabilizing stage, whatever it means. But for Ukraine in general, and for me as representative of civil society, this is not an answer, because we believe that the process of establishing the mechanism should start now, because modern conflicts and this war would not end with the decisive win over Russia signing, some kind of capitulation, World War I or World War II style. We understand that this is a protracted scene, and we probably will move from ceasefire to ceasefire until we as Ukraine reach our ultimate goal of restoring our sovereignty and territorial integrity. So the reparation process should start as soon as possible, before their even their hot period of armed conflict is ended. Then we should talk about the principles of the reparations. The major principles are justice and accountability. So justice to all victims of Russian aggression, and transparency of the process when we know who gets what and under which mechanisms, principles. So it's not. There is, of course, the question whether this is centralized or decentralized process of giving this reparations. This could be discussed on particular case by case, or just mechanism issues. And the third important thing is their source of funding for those reparations. Because there is a lot of talks internationally and inside of Ukraine that, okay, we have a lot of funds already seized from Russia, both from the Russian government and from Russian oligarchs. And all this money should serve the victims of Russian aggression. And it should be done as soon as possible. And this money are already available. meaning that we should not wait the goodwill from Russia to pay this money, or we should not wait this decisive victory or the agreement signed by Russia, or await their UN decisions of some sort. I think Markian will follow up on the challenges of this.
Yes, and so I will turn it over to Mr. Kluczykowski, but some of the things that have been noted already by Ms. Shevchuk, and then also in the chat, there's this question of, well, there's timing, there's funding. In the chat, funding was mentioned as a question. In the chat also was Russia's role in being an impediment to all of this. For example, its role in the GA and its role on the UN Security Council. And I know that you've already mentioned in earlier in our discussion that your project was considering that issue. And so if you could address some of those as part of your challenges.
Absolutely. Again, drawing on arbitration experience, there's always fundamentally two big issues that you look at assessing any case. One is in the very beginning, the other one is at the very end. In the very beginning, there's a question of jurisdiction. Is this our arbitral tribunal, is it competent to hear this particular case against this particular respondent? Same here, jurisdiction is consent. And obviously, we're not going to have Russia's consent to establish a body that will hear or adjudicate any claims against it. Neither do we have the next best alternative, the Security Council resolution. So echoing one of the questions that was asked, what can be expected from the Security Council considering Russia's role as a permanent member? Well, not much, to be honest. But that does not mean that the UN framework is completely out of the question, because we can rely on other instruments. Specifically, we can rely on Uniting for Peace precedent from 1950 that basically gives the General Assembly the right to take action in a situation where the veto right is abused in the Security Council. And we have an opportunity to rely on the recent veto initiative voted through the General Assembly that kicks down any question that was vetoed in the Security Council down to the General Assembly. And General Assembly is going to be important because we, in the lack of consent of Russia, we want to make sure that the mechanism that we establish does have legal justification and legal legitimacy. It's not going to be just a bunch of states getting together and putting an instrument that puts another state on trial. Let's put it this way. It's not like that. It's going to be an instrument that is in response to a grave violation of the very fundamental principles of international law. So this is challenge number one. We have to build that legitimacy, considering that there really isn't a precedent like that, because international law system as it was designed in 1945 in the post-war world did not really anticipate that a permanent member of the Security Council would be the one violating the very fundamentals of it. Now, taking a look at the back end of any legal proceedings or an arbitration or proceedings like that is the enforcement of the judgment. How do you get paid? Again, considering that Russia is not going to pay voluntarily, we're pretty sure about that. And echoing here comments by Ms. Shevchuk, the next best alternative is the vast Russian assets that are located outside of its borders and that are already blocked, frozen, or will be blocked or frozen through a sanctions regime or otherwise. Now, I would probably stop short of saying that these assets are readily available, because to get to them, we still have to go through some challenges. When we talk about assets owned by the Russian state itself, we have to overcome the issue of sovereign immunity. And here we're also building a case that sovereign immunity cannot be used as a shield to hide from responsibility for an act of aggression or similar egregious violation of jus cogens, of the fundamental principles of international law. But again, it's a bit of a departure from an existing precedent. So we have to build that position carefully and diligently. When we talk about the assets of private parties, who we call oligarchs, we have to deal with the principles of inviolability of private property and the guarantees that are vested by, for example, the European Convention on Human Rights. So we have to build these issues, build a position on these issues to establish the legitimacy of any instrument and establish the instruments that will convert these assets into funds from which the victims of Russian aggression will ultimately be paid. But that all being said, the purpose of that work is also to create a situation where there is a strong incentive for Russia to come back into the fold of the civilized world and start cooperating a little bit with this compensation mechanism. Because in a somewhat perfect scenario, and I use that term loosely, but in that best case scenario, we would have something similar to the scheme used by UNGC when the claims were funded by a share of oil export revenue of Iraq, and similarly, it could be the energy export revenue of Russia could be used to fund these claims. So we have to create a situation where Russia feels boxed in enough to start cooperating with this mechanism. And these are just some of the challenges that in reality we face. Many of them arise out of the simple fact that, like I said before, this mechanism does not really have a precedent that we can rely on. So we can draw on examples from various instances like the UNCC or, for example, the Iran-US Claims Tribunal. But in reality, we have to put something together that is entirely new. But what I would agree entirely with Ms. Shevchuk and others is that there really is no point and no reason to wait until anything ends or even stabilizes. One of my favorite analogies that I like to use in this context comes from one of the interviews of Professor Sands, who reminded us that the reason why the Nuremberg Tribunal was able to start working so quickly after the end of World War II is that work on it began in 1942, where the end of the Second World War wasn't even in sight. So we do have to start working on that right now. Besides, there are issues, that there are areas in Ukraine in which the conflict has stabilized, for the lack of a better word, where Russian armed forces have withdrawn from, and the scope of damage and the atrocities is quite clear. So there is no reason why we in Ukraine and the world at large should wait any minute before starting to work and address these issues.
Yes, thank you. Continuing on with challenges and also, looking at what we can learn from the past, and Mr. Kluchkovsky mentioned some past examples and how those might inform what we do today. Mr. Hazra, I wanted to sort of turn it to you and just sort of say, based on comparative state practice, do you have any other thoughts that you can address, ideas for how to meet some of these challenges that we've already been discussing when it comes to reparations for Ukraine?
Yeah, I think when you look at prior claims commissions or restitution commissions, I mean, the list of challenges is extensive, and it is a very difficult process. And I think the two that I would highlight, the first one is going to be pretty obvious, and it's what we've been discussing for a while. It's the money, it's funding. That's a very significant challenge for many of these commissions. And I think, we're in quite a unique position here in the sense of we are going to have an aggressor who is in a very significant position of power, able to block many of the usual channels. And this is why some of the work that Mr. Kluchkovsky has been talking about, I think sounds to me to be absolutely essential to be able to try and build the sort of funding foundations that many of these claims commissions will require. And I appreciate there are many challenges in doing that. The second type of challenge that we've observed very significantly relates to the volumes of claims and the actual implementation of many of these tribunals. I mean, we've discussed on this panel just how widespread some of the damage and effect of Russia's invasion has been in Ukraine. And so there's a tremendous scale of people who are going to be affected by this. And I think what we found is that a number of previous commissions have been overwhelmed essentially by the sheer amount of claims, and the ability to get compensation to people in a timely manner is seriously affected. one of the tools that some commissions have used to be able to address that is an element of localization to decision making, particularly where you have multiple population centers or vast rural areas that have been affected. And so rather than centralizing decision making in a single body, there's a larger bureaucracy and a bit of a hierarchy where more decisions are taken at a local level, with an appeals process up to a more central level, so that it's possible to deal with the large volume of claims that one might expect. I mean, those are two of the challenges, but as I said, there are many others.
Excellent. I want to turn it to Professor Blank and discuss reparations a little more fully. And I will note that Professor Blank has written an article recently about reparations and a reparations mechanism in Ukraine. And as I ask this question, I was also hoping that Professor Blank might be able to address a question in the chat that talks about who will be eligible for reparations. Will Ukrainian soldiers be included as victims? How would we deal with ex-combatants and some things like that? So maybe if you could touch on that as well, Professor Blank.
Sure. So this has been a really great discussion about a lot of the mechanics and challenges, obviously, of which there are many. One of the things I want to add into the mix here in thinking through kind of the big picture, and I agree 100% that the process should start now, and obviously it is, right? That's why there's lots of conversations going on. But one piece of this is thinking through, again, within Ukraine, what is the goal, right? And that may sound really obvious. Well, the goal is to get compensated, right? I mean, that it's pretty obvious, but is the goal purely compensation, using that term broadly? So monetary restitution of any property taken, return of individuals who have been forcibly deported, kind of the returning to, as best we can, where we were before. But another piece is acknowledgement. And reparations are not only something tangible, but there's also an important symbolic aspect. You mentioned, I think at the beginning, the idea of symbolic reparations, whether they be apologies and other things. And I think that it's important to incorporate into the conversation, whatever the answer ends up being, whatever the comfort level of those who are involved in the process is, with how to prioritize, how to balance things like, well, perhaps through any number of different either negotiated mechanisms or other types of processes, can get more funds, but no acknowledgement of responsibility or harm. Does that matter, right? Or is there a real need among victims to have, like, I'm going to take responsibility on the part, Russia's going to take responsibility? Those are hard questions, but they're important, because it's important to try to avoid down the road sort of the dissatisfaction of, XYZ might have made certain communities feel more comfortable with the result. One piece of that is getting a little deeper into the who is a victim, as you asked as part of this question. The fact that one huge piece of Russia's violations is the crime of aggression has introduced the question of, are Ukrainian soldiers, are combatants, victims who are entitled to or should be included in the compensation process. We tend to think about the harm to civilians because that's where our brains go when we think about harms committed during armed conflict. But there has been a fair amount of discussion at the UN Human Rights Committee and other venues about the fact that a crime of aggression violates the right to life of everybody who is harmed in the course of that aggression, which would mean that both civilians and combatants in Ukraine merit consideration as victims in a compensation process. The International Court of Justice encountered this question in its recent decision on reparations in the armed activities case out of Uganda and Democratic Republic of Congo. And it included the jus ad bellum violation in the harm that it was assessing. But when it ultimately ordered specific amounts of reparations, those were all tied to jus in bello violations. That doesn't really tell us a firm answer of, no, you can't quantify aggression in terms of compensation, but it might hint that perhaps they had some challenges, right? So the last thing I would say is thinking about how do you quantify the harm caused by aggression versus the harm caused by specific violations of the law of armed conflict. And it's not an insurmountable challenge, it's just a different question.
Thank you. I'm going to turn it to Professor Giorgetti. We are getting close to running out of time. I do want to talk just a little bit more about paying for the reparations. And there is a question in the chat that addresses that question. And I know that Mr. Kluchkovsky has already discussed this as well. But I did sort of want to give you a chance to sort of tell us a little bit more about that and the legality of using frozen assets, et cetera, to pay.
Thank you very much. I actually I agree with everything that Markian has already said, and other speakers have already talked about this, but I wanted to follow up very quickly on 2 points. One is the role of the General Assembly. As it was said already, the role of the General Assembly can actually be quite transformational, especially within the framework of the Uniting for Peace. And within that framework, the General Assembly has done quite a bit. For example, it has created a commission of inquiry, or it has created a registry for claims in the context of Palestinian claims coming from the in application of the advisory opinion on the construction of the wall of the ICJ. And under Article 22 of the UN Charter, there is no doubt that the General Assembly can create subsidiary bodies. So the General Assembly within this United for Peace framework can have a very substantial role, can have a secondary role when the Security Council cannot act. Then the General Assembly can act on peace and security issues, and has done so. So I think what we have learned from the General Assembly is quite interesting. But of course, this challenge is unique. So the role of the General Assembly will be unique, and the solution will also be unique. And of course, we look also then at the funding. And I think there are many ways to go about that too. All we of course with the challenges, but not insurmountable. And I think there are legal ways to obtain funds. And so, for example, there are different ways in which funds will be obtained. Of course, we have a large, substantial amount of frozen funds, about I think 300 billion funds from the Russian State Bank, but many others from oligarchs and many others. Of course, if we think about sovereign funds, that we run into the issue of immunity. And the issue of immunities are also being resolved domestically. So we have to look then at different domestic jurisdiction, but we are here also in the situation of a crime erga omnes, the crime of aggression, and a jus cogens violation. So there might be a waiver of issues that the General Assembly can take up there too. But this is not the only source of funding. Obviously the voluntary fundings, but there might be possible to create a levy or a tax on Russian sale of oil, for example. And here historically can also be interesting looking at lessons learned from the UNCC. Here, as it was mentioned, the resolution, compensation was funded by diverting a percentage of the oil revenue from the sale of Iraqi oil to special funds under a Security Council resolution that was then paid, that was used to pay the UNCC. The Iran-US Claims Tribunal also provides a very interesting alternative way of funding, because there Iran agreed to put some funds that had been previously been frozen to a special account to pay damages and injuries and always replenish that fund. So again, this is a unique situation. It requires a unique solution, but there are many examples that can be used to do this within international legal norms and with legitimacy from the international community.
Thank you, Professor Giorgetti. That's all that we have time for today. I thank everyone for joining us and for submitting questions. The webinar recording will be available on the PILPG website, and it will be shared with all attendees on Zoom via email. This event was, again, part of the PILPG Thought Leadership Ukraine series. Thank you very much to all of our panelists for taking the time today to talk about the recent developments in Ukraine and Russia, and for providing your analysis of the potential for reparations for Ukraine. To follow along with the Ukraine series, please join us for our next event on July 22, where experts will present draft legislation for a high war crimes court for Ukraine to prosecute those responsible for atrocity crimes in Ukraine. PILPG has worked with a number of international and Ukrainian experts to prepare this legislation. And thank you, and we will see you on the 22nd.
Thank you.